I am honored to get to participate and share some of what I have observed with you all. For those of you who don't know me, I have a consulting business called Cooperative Coaching. I also have a business called CoApp, a sister business called CoApp, which is a database and contact management systems for co-ops to help organize their ownership data and track their capital campaigns. So I've been doing this kind of work, specializing in capital campaigns since 2017. And when I left Green Top Grocery, I had worked for Green Top Grocery, a startup co-op in Bloomington, Illinois for 5 years before they opened. So no one cares that much about me, so we'll just talk about what you're here for, and that's to talk about readiness for your capital campaign. And over the last 5 years, I've had the opportunity to work on 14 capital campaigns and working currently on 4 more that are getting ready to launch capital campaigns as we speak. And through that work, I've been able to identify some factors that indicate whether a co-op is going to be successful or not. And as JQ mentioned, there are some things we can check off the list. Have you done this or have you done that? But we're looking at some other kinds of more subjective observations on whether or not a co-op will be successful or not. One thing I'd like to do is ask you to keep in mind that what I'm sharing with you today is based on a couple assumptions. First of all, one of those assumptions being that the observations that I'm making today are based off of co-ops who are raising funds using preferred shares, loans, and donations. So co-ops are using lots of ways to raise funds now, grants and other funding sources. So we're not necessarily talking about those. What I'm referring to today are co-ops who have utilized traditional capital campaigns, so to speak, in terms of their fundraising with loans, shares, and donations. Also, this is generalized information. So I didn't specify whether this applies to large communities or small communities or urban settings or rural settings. Just generally speaking, what I'm observing when I'm working with co-ops who have had success or failure, actually, in terms of the success of their capital campaign. And then the final assumption is that these co-ops that I've been working with and that I've been observing have been using the 4 and 3 model. So the standard 4 cornerstones and 3 stages model. So just to keep that in mind as we're going through the slides. Okay, I have separated these indicators into 2 categories, objective and subjective. As we know, objective things are more measurable, factual, statistical, things we can check off the list or quantify in some regard. And then there are subjective measurements or subjective indicators, and those are more anecdotal, experience-based, opinion-based. So we're going to start with the objective indicators. And the first one, clearly, and I think hopefully if you're thinking about a capital campaign, you have done this already, but if you have not, absolutely having an adequate number of owners is a critical indicator of success. And it's really important to do the math. We know based on recent capital campaigns that about 25% of owners will participate in a capital campaign. That means they will buy a loan or buy shares, make a loan, or make a donation to your campaign. And that number does fluctuate between 25 and 35%. But for our purposes today, we'll keep it simple and stick with the 25%. And if you want to talk about whether or not your co-op is ready and schedule a consultation after the fact later on, we'll talk about lots of different statistics and factors and look at different scenarios in terms of your co-op's ability to be successful in terms of the number of owners that you have. So we know that 25% of owners will invest, and we know that there's an investment average. Right now, that average is about $4,000. And that, if we do that math, that indicates our fundraising potential. So as an example, let's just do some of that math. Let's pretend that we're at a co-op that has 1,000 owners. So 1,000 owners, and 25% of that is 250 owners, right? And if our average contribution our average investment is $4,000. We're looking at raising about $1 million with 1,000 owners. Now, as I said, there's lots of different scenarios we can play with, but just doing that math is a really key indicator. And some co-ops jump into this having not done that math. And if you do that math and you're only raising $500,000 or $600,000 and your project cost is, well over that, it's time to think some more about your ownership number and when you launch your campaign. So a couple other objective indicators are a viable location and a workable pro forma. So as I mentioned, these assumptions and these indicators that I'm sharing with you today are based on observations of co-ops who are using that 4 and 3 model. So what we're talking about here is all of the hard work that goes into opening your capital campaign, doing the due diligence to find the right location, completing the market studies, working that pro forma so that it's viable, and doing so in a way, in a professional way. And we'll talk about that in a minute here. But doing that work is critical to your success. And it's critical for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's very difficult to sell investments, to share the investment opportunity with your co-op if it's not workable. It's for me, morally, I can't ask someone to invest in something that we haven't done the due diligence to see if it's doable, to see if this is going to work, to see if our co-op can be successful. So if you haven't done that work, then your owners are not going to buy into the investment opportunity, and you won't have the success that you're looking for in your capital campaign. In addition, we're seeing co-ops include preferred shares in their capital campaign offers. And I should say we're seeing startups include preferred shares in their capital campaign offerings more so recently than we have in the past. Existing co-ops have done so quite extensively for quite some time and had great success with it where it's legally allowed in states. But we're seeing that transition over to the startup world with success. Co-ops are having success selling preferred shares. But in order to sell preferred shares, your bylaws have to indicate that you have that option. And if you haven't done the groundwork to review those bylaws with an attorney, make those adjustments, you're not going to be as successful. And that takes time. So a bylaw change typically requires a vote of your ownership. So this isn't just a real quick, change the wording in this document and here we go kind of thing. I mean, we had to, this is legally drafted language that gets presented to your ownership and voted on. And depending on when your annual meeting is, and if you can conduct a vote outside of an annual meeting, and your efficiency in doing so really can impact your readiness for your capital campaign. So if you have not done that, if you're considering preferred shares and you have not reviewed your bylaws, you absolutely should do that. And certainly, if and when your co-op does do that, it does pursue that, it impacts your timing. So, you can't want to launch your capital campaign March 1st and just start reviewing your bylaws today, February 1st. We don't have enough time. It's not going to be successful. So absolutely making sure those bylaws are in order is an indicator of whether you'll be successful. Now, strong communication with owners. This is one of those more subjective items, but I listed on the objective indicators as well as subjective because there's some things we can measure. There's some factual data we can look at in terms of communication. And here I'm talking about frequency. How many times are you communicating with owners via email, via social media? What's that frequency? What's that regularity? What's your open rate? Are you sending an email out once or twice a year and 10% of people open it? Well, that's not strong communication with your ownership. If you're sending an email out once or twice a month and your open rate is 30%, 40%, okay, now you have an engaged audience. Now you're moving towards that strong communication with your ownership. So looking at those stats, including your social media stats, how frequently are you posting? What's your engagement? What's your reach? Those are statistical numbers we can look at to see, is our audience engaged? Is our co-op paying attention? Are they following along and interested in what we're doing? And if they are, then we're going to be more successful when it comes time to raise capital. And co-ops that are successful are using professional guidance. The work that we're doing is immense. You know, the list of things on our to-do list as cooperators opening co-ops is long. It's so long, I mean, years long. We all know that, and we all feel that. And we don't always have the expertise among our volunteer base, among our organizers, to do everything we need to do. And when co-ops do not use professional guidance, they are less successful. So, you know, oftentimes we have someone in our community who might be a lawyer or might be a store designer. And sometimes those situations work out and sometimes they work. But using a professional who specializes in co-ops really does set you apart in terms of your ability to be successful. So knowing your pro forma from a cooperative background, legally, what we're doing in a capital campaign with preferred shares and loans is a complicated legal offering. And you absolutely need to utilize a lawyer, and you need to utilize a lawyer who specializes in cooperative development. And you know, we're always pressed for budgets in the cooperative startup world. Affording these kinds of services is often a challenge, but the co-ops who spend money to make money end up making money. So really and truly, if you spend the money, if you invest the money in that professional guidance, it will serve you well moving forward. Clearly, I'm a little biased since I also provide professional guidance, but what I'm talking about here is really the legal side of things and the pro forma side of things. Really getting the guidance that you need professionally in those categories is really important for your success. So there are subjective indicators of whether a co-op is going to be successful. And as we talked about, communication being on both the objective and subjective side of the equation here. And according to me, in my opinion, our communication with our ownership really is critical to our success. If we don't have regular, consistent, professional communication with our owners, then we're going to struggle when it comes time to a capital campaign. And when I say that regular, strong communication with owners, that's part of the equation, but having the team in place to execute that is also part of the equation. So doing the work and communicating with owners is one thing, but having the team in place to do that, and to do that to the extent you need to during a capital campaign, which is much more intense, is another thing. When we're talking about capital campaign communication and that strong connection with our ownership, what we're talking about here is tone and professionalism and education and content. So is what we're presenting and communicating to our owners done so on a regular and consistent basis? Is the structure of our communication solid and professional? Is our tone uplifting and exciting and engaging? And is our content valuable? Owners aren't going to open our emails and read our posts if we're not providing value to them, if the content is not engaging. And so really, co-ops that struggle with communication struggle in their capital campaign. If you can't communicate regularly, if you can't get in front of your audience on a very consistent basis during your capital campaign, you have very little chance of success. So this is one of those really key indicators. And I talk about co-op communication or capital campaign communication like an NPR campaign. So you know when NPR is raising money, every time you turn on the radio, it's the only thing you hear. Make your pledge, call today, help us fund this valuable resource. That's all you hear over and over and over until they hit their goal and raise their money. That's what we're doing in a cooperative capital campaign. It has to be that frequent, that regular, that consistent, so that whenever anyone is talking about the co-op, they're talking about the capital campaign. If they see anything from the co-op, it's about the capital campaign. 90% of the time, we want our audience to talk about the capital campaign when we are in a capital campaign. And so if you don't have that foundation already established before you launch your capital campaign, it's not going to work once you start raising money. Those people weren't paying attention before, they sure as heck aren't paying attention now. But if they are paying attention, they're going to pay even more attention now because they see the urgency and the energy and the excitement. So that's really a critical one. Let's see here. The next one I want to talk about is leadership. So in a capital campaign, you typically have leadership, and that can take different forms in different co-ops. It can be one person, it can be 3 people, it can be 5 people even in terms of a leadership team. But the key is that team, whether it's 1 or 3 or 5, no matter the size, is extremely committed, competent, and engaged. If that leader is distracted, and by distracted, I mean, they have 100 other things going on in their life, or a sick family member, or, babies that need attention more. So, everyone's in a different place in their life, but you need someone in this role whom this is their focus. They need to be giving this campaign 110%. And it's a weight. This is a heavy weight to carry. I like to talk, when I talk with capital campaign leaders, it's the responsibility that we're carrying in helping our co-op raise this fund. So you have to have the right person who has the shoulders to carry that weight and who can execute it. Co-ops who find that leader are successful. Co-ops who don't find that leader aren't. I mean, it's just that simple. It really boils down to that. Your processes and your systems are critical. When you think about, and this is a hard thing for me to articulate. Even over the last 5 years, I struggle to articulate the volume of information you have to keep track of in a capital campaign. There are, let's just say we're on the same example of 1,000 owners. 1,000 owners, 250 of them are going to make a pledge to us. How we keep track of who's pledged and who hasn't, and who we've called and who we haven't, and how much JQ is pledging versus how much Katie is pledging, and her interest rate versus my interest rate, and who got their packet of information and who didn't get their packet. That is a huge undertaking to keep track of all of that and to not let any balls drop. And that's really important, because if JQ makes a $5,000 loan to my co-op and I don't send her the paperwork, and she has to email me 2 weeks later and say, hey, I never got that paperwork, I look like our co-op looks bad. We look like we don't know what we're doing. We don't have any systems in place. How did we not send her that paperwork? Or worse yet, if JQ makes a $5,000 loan and wherever I documented that loan isn't available to all the other callers, and someone else calls her and asks her to make a loan, all credibility lost. We're game over. JQ is out. She's like, no way. You guys don't know what you're doing. I'm not giving you $5,000. I'm not giving you any money. So we really have to put those systems and processes in place so that when JQ makes her loan, we know exactly what happens next. And there's a system that triggers, that she gets the packet, the person who sends that packet, or the system that sends that packet, gets triggered and packet goes to her. And a week later, we have a follow-up scheduled and we check in with her and we plot this all out so that when you execute your campaign, all of this happens seamlessly. And those 250 people who are coming forward to give your co-op money think you know what you're doing. And you do, because you put these systems and processes in place. And that's one of the things we developed co-op for, but that's another topic. But it is a way to do that, a way for you to keep track of those interactions and those transactions. Co-ops who are successful invest time in preparation and execution of their capital campaign. This is not a small undertaking. I like to recommend that co-ops plan their capital campaign 3 to 6 months in advance of when they'd like to launch it. This takes time and energy, and that is 3 to 6 months of a team of people, 3 to 5 people working on this at a pretty quick pace and with some pretty intense time involved. This is not just something you throw together at the last minute and run off and start. Co-ops that invest in that preparation, who actually make a task list and check things off and hold each other accountable, really and truly are more successful than the co-ops who don't invest in that preparation. Along with that, co-ops who don't invest in the silent phase of their capital campaign are less successful than co-ops that do. So the silent phase of fundraising really is that that lead time ahead of your capital campaign, when you're getting those founding lead contributions, lead investments, so that when you kick off your capital campaign, you can announce, oh, we're already 10% of our goal. We've already hit 20% of our goal. And when we don't invest the time and energy into that silent phase, we see less success. Co-ops that are successful in their silent phase of fundraising, 9 times out of 10 are successful in hitting their goal. It's just a fact of the matter, really and truly. And when I'm working with co-ops, as I have mentioned a couple times today, there's so much on our to-do list in general of our in opening a co-op. But when you're talking about a capital campaign, there's a lot to do. And I help co-ops develop spreadsheets of, tabs and tabs of tasks and lines of things that need to be done. But there's so much to do that we often neglect the silent phase. Yes, JQ.
We got several comments that I should have brought up a little earlier, and I kept trying to find a place. Sorry. We did have a question. Are these systems and processes, like during the capital campaign you're talking about, or is this something that the co-op app helps with? The co-op? Yes,
it can. Absolutely. It can help with that. It can automate some of those processes for you. Absolutely.
And from Sola, what kind of messaging works in the pre-launch period? How do we let owners know to get ready that a capital campaign is coming?
That's a great question. And I have a content package that I'm working on right now that I've been soliciting pledges for co-ops that does exactly this. So in the past, I have put together some content offerings that co-ops have pledged. Individual co-ops have pledged $100, $200 for, and to fund the co-op, to fund the content. We release it for everyone. There's one available right now for capital campaign pledges or capital campaign readiness. So it includes, and to answer that question, you have to prepare your audience for what a capital campaign at a co-op is and how we raise funds. So oftentimes owners of the co-op, we're all engaged in this. This is all fun and games for us. A lot of us spend a lot of time and energy on our co-op, but the majority of our owners don't. They bought a share because you asked them to, because their neighbor did it, because they are interested in the environment, because they want local food. They're not as into it as we are. So they don't understand necessarily the nuts and bolts like you and I do. So we need to educate them about how our co-op is funded and how much it costs to open a grocery store. Oftentimes, our owners, they don't think about that. They give you their share purchase, their $200 or $250, and they think that's enough to open the grocery store. So we have to educate them about how much money we need and where that money will come from and how we will use it. And the very unique thing about cooperative capital campaigns is where that money will come from, that middle piece. And because we uniquely raise funds through loans and shares, which is quite different from any other kind of fundraising, we need to spend a lot of time in our campaign communication preparing our audience for that. So talking to them about what a capital campaign includes, what are preferred shares, what are loans, how do co-ops fund? And so this package that I've been talking about, or that I've mentioned here, is 90 days of content. So it's 3 posts a week, 3 videos by John Steinman that are just fantastic, that really kind of lay out how co-ops fund and why we do it this way. And there are different links. You can use them in different avenues. But really investing the time and energy in preparing your audience for the inevitability that you'll be raising money really is critical. That's a great question. And I could talk about that for days.
We've got a couple more great questions, but I think that I don't think they match what we're doing right now. So let's see if we can come back to them at the end. A little bit of talking about setting up the prep teams, who's on them, some stuff that I think maybe we'll circle back toward the end. Does that sound okay?
Sure. That sounds good. And we're almost finished here. I'm almost through what I've prepared here. So we can spend lots of time on questions if we need to. Okay, so we talked about the preparation and execution of the campaign itself, but we don't want to lose sight of the preparation and execution of that silent phase campaign. So as I was saying, we have so much on our to-do list that often that falls to the bottom of the list because we have so much to do that we just don't invest the time and energy in that we need to. And I will say a little bit more about the silent phase. Traditionally, in the silent phase of the campaign, you're asking your board, your committed volunteers, your long-term owners, people maybe who have come to you ahead of time and said, hey, I'm interested in investing. Let me know when you're ready. Those are the people that we're talking to when we're talking about the silent phase of the campaign. But it's also important to include large capacity contributions in this phase as well. So what I'm talking about here are people in your community who have the ability to lend or donate or invest $100,000, $250,000, and starting those conversations as early as you can. And this is work that can be done, long before your capital campaign exists. And I hope you're doing this work all along, but building relationships with community partners who can participate in your capital campaign in the future if it fits with their organization. So starting those conversations with those larger capacity investors during the silent phase is really critical because those types of contributions take time. So a foundation, let's say a hospital foundation in your community who's really interested in healthy food, they might be really interested in your project, but they fund, quarterly, and their funding cycle is outside of the window of the capital campaign. So if you don't start early enough, you're not into that. You miss that window of their funding. So starting those kinds of conversations in the silent phase and even earlier, so that when the time comes to raise capital, you've already got that solid relationship and foundation in place so that you can be successful. And co-ops who are doing that all along, who are building those relationships and establishing that credibility in their community, really are more successful in the end when it comes to capital campaign fundraising. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. So we can take questions.
All right, well then I'll go back to the top of the list. And I just shared with everyone your video about all about the silent phase of capital campaigns from our last time you presented at FCI Live in case people want to check that out.
Oh, great.
So questions, let me move down here. One of them I want to make sure I didn't skip. I told you I'd get back to this because I missed the gap to talk about this. What wording in bylaws would prevent preferred shares from being an opportunity? Do you have any examples of that?
I don't have anything in front of me, but your bylaws either do or don't allow you to sell preferred shares. There's language in there that would address preferred shares. It's typically under capitalization section of the bylaws. And if you would send me an email afterwards, I could try to send you some examples, but I don't have anything in front of me.
And it's up to you, Katie. We've been telling people that if they want, we'll do this at the end, don't do it now. If they want to drop their email in the chat, that we'll send you the chat log and you can collect those emails and send people follow up. And that way it's a choice,
Sure.
for folks. So we don't share your information with our presenters unless you do participate. So at the end, we'll say, hey, if you want your email to be given to Katie to send you more information, then there'll be a moment I say that and you drop your email in the chat, okay? Could you say more about these prep teams? Are these committees? Is it just a couple board members, consultants? Like, who's on the prep team?
Yeah, good question. Good question. The prep, you need a planning team. So I think about a capital campaign. I wish I had made a slide for this, but I think about the capital campaign kind of like you think of an org chart. So you've got the board at the top. You got the board. Oh, you can't see that. Never mind. You have the board at the top, and then you have a capital campaign planning team below that. And whether that's one person or 3 people or 5 people, whatever that looks like for you. And then you have subcommittees under that. You have people who are working on communication. You've got people working on the legal documents. You got a team working on your data and your tracking system. And you lay out the work streams needed to execute your capital campaign. So at the beginning, it's probably 1 to 3 people that are doing the planning work, laying the groundwork, and then that team grows over time as you get closer and closer to implementing and launching your capital campaign. So hopefully that answers that question. And also I would recommend, if you, whomever asked that question, the FCI workbook, the capital campaign workbook, spells out a lot of that as well in terms of what teams are needed, what people are needed.
Yeah, I'll see if I get a chance. Thank you for bringing that up. I'll see if I get a chance to go get that link for y'all. It is on our website. It needs some updating. I will say that it's very much aimed at 5 years ago. So, but it's a good base.
It's a starting point. Absolutely.
This one I think is really broad, but we'll go there. Is there a benefit to people in contributing to the capital campaign aside from seeing their co-op open? Is it a donation or a loan or something else?
Oh goodness, I could talk all day about this. This is why capital campaigns are successful, in my opinion, because we offer an investment opportunity that is unique to co-ops. So yes, major benefit is that your co-op opens. You get to walk through the doors of your store. There are so many other benefits to investing in the co-op, and depending on the structure of your capital campaign, you can earn interest or dividend on your investment if and when the co-op is successful. Not to mention, you're matching your values with your investments. There are lots of ways that we can invest our money, many of which we have zero control over. We put our funds in our money in a fund at Edward Jones, and we have no idea who's using that money. It could be things that we don't support, things that aren't important to us or aligned with our values. Whereas at the co-op, you can see that those investments are aligned with your values, and you get to actually watch your investment work. You get to see the store built. You get to see people shopping. You get to shop. And you're investing, in the local economy as well, because it's churning money in your community. Your contractors are being hired, and people are staffing, and we're hiring from or purchasing from local producers. So I could talk for 3 days about the benefits of investing at the co-op.
Excellent. Can you talk briefly about the budget for capital campaigns? Do you have any examples you can even share?
Absolutely, I do. And I have a budget template that I make available for free to anyone who wants it. And it depends on lots of factors. Every co-op's budget is different. But I think when you look at my budgets, this budget is based on averages. So the average I see spent at co-ops and capital campaigns across these 14 or 19 I've been working with here the last 5 years. It's in I would say, depending on what you need and where you decide to spend your money, $40,000 to $60,000 it costs to execute a capital campaign. Legal services are a huge portion of that, $10,000 to $15,000 of that. A tracking system we're finding is a considerable expense. Using a Google Sheet is no longer the best practice, and is not as reliable or safe, so to speak, as a tracking system. And there are lots of options, co-op being one of them. So, but to use one that works well, the free services tend to not offer the bells and whistles that we need to execute our campaign. So there's funds needed there. And consulting services, your pro forma, capital campaign consulting, those are chunks of money. So there are printing costs and event costs, lots of things that go into that budget, but on average, we're looking at $40,000 to $60,000 probably to execute a successful campaign.
Great. Okay. Chrissy, great question. Is there a good strategic way to identify the folks to target in your silent phase, particularly in a more rural community? You mentioned folks that have the capacity to give in larger amounts, but is there a good way to find these folks?
Yeah, great question. So typically what co-ops do is kind of a grassroots approach. And this is what has worked. And there are avenues to do this in a more mainstream fashion. You can pay for this. You can buy the data. There are services who will, you can search for organizations that'll tell you how much money you can raise in your community. But we typically don't see that happen in co-ops. I haven't seen a co-op use that. But what happens typically is a confidential evaluation of your ownership list. That's where you start. And that happens usually at the board level. and can include other community members if you do so professionally and confidentially. So you bring people into the room and you go through the list and you say, who knows who, and at what level do we think they could or would participate in a capital campaign? So that's a starting point for you. We can also do some math then as well, like how many contributions do we need at this level and this level, and then who can fit those levels. Like if we need $200,000 contributions, we probably need a list of 4 or 5 people at that level. So identifying who those 4 or 5 people are starts with your board and that evaluation. That also can happen on an ongoing basis. So as you're developing your co-op and doing the groundwork, the conversations that you're having along the way, I encourage you to keep track of and keep note of in some kind of form or fashion. So when you have a meeting with the community foundation, or when you talk to, the farmer who inherited, $10 million of farmland and doesn't know what to do with all their money, that you're making notes of these things. So when it comes time to raise your capital, you've got a starting point and you've got a pool of people to approach.
We have, could you speak more about timeline, specifically how capital campaigning and launch overlaps with site search and other core pieces of development?
Yeah, that's a great point. We didn't talk a lot about the site, but having a viable site, we talked about doing the diligence there in the market study, but we didn't necessarily talk about the site itself. But having a site is really critical. It's really hard to raise money if you can't tell people what you're raising money for, if they can't see it, if they can't look at it, if they don't know where it is. It's much more of a challenge. So in terms of the timeline, I think about the work that we're doing in multiple streams, so like concurrent streams. So there's the work to open your co-op and there's your capital campaign, and they're happening at the same time. So the foundational, you're doing your pro forma work and your market studies, all of that is happening at the same time you're planning your capital campaign. So in a perfect world, all of that planning and execution with your site and your pro forma line up with what you're doing in your capital campaign. But sometimes, that doesn't always work. But what happens is your site will be ready, your pro forma is viable, and the capital campaign team will then decide when are we going to launch our campaign. What effectively works is to announce your sites, which is a really big energizing event and exciting, and you'll get owner growth and lots of excitement, engagement. And then soon after that, follow up with the capital campaign launch so that, you don't lose that momentum and people see progress is happening and this is how it's working. So in terms of timeline, depending on the co-op, that can be 3 months, 6 months, it varies, but it does happen concurrently in a lot of cases.
We're getting some questions. Some of them are a little more like project management-y. But I'm going to jump back and I'm going to take space for just a second and ask you a question.
Hey.
So I think if you could talk a little bit more, like what does it look like what should people be looking for in that communication momentum? Like you say, numbers, social media posts, that's very manageable, very measurable. But I think there's also, we've both seen startups who communicate frequently, but there's no magic, like there's no interaction, can you talk more about, and we see groups who then try and build it for like a month before starting a capital campaign. Can you talk more about what that communication and momentum has looked like at co-ops that have been successful?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say it looks like regular and frequent communication that's engaging, regular, frequent, engaging communication. So let's talk about a newsletter. What does that look like? If you're not sending a regular email newsletter to your ownership, you should be. They need to hear from you. They need to know what's going on. We're head into this. We're so focused on this that we can't imagine no one else knows what we're doing. But no one knows, really and truly, your owners don't know what you're doing. They don't know the hard work. They don't know the number of meetings you're attending and the hard work that you're doing and the events that you're at. They don't know it. So we have to talk to them about it. And when we're talking about your email communication, I think it's important to have structure. So you have whatever that structure looks like for you, but it's consistent. So An example would be a message from your president, an outreach update, a calendar of events, and a capital campaign section or a funding section. And consistently, whether that's once a month, once a week, once every 2 weeks, that goes out, and it goes out regularly. So it goes out on Mondays at 10 a.m. And like clockwork, it's out on Mondays at 10 a.m. And we have a schedule and we have a team who are working to that schedule so that we can get that email out on Mondays at 10 a.m. That consistency, that professionalism engages owners and it builds credibility. So that's one example. Same thing goes for social media. Consistent, regular, engaging. If we post once a week, sometimes on Tuesday, sometimes on Friday, sometimes we don't post, nobody's watching us. No one's seeing that. It's not triggering any, well, those, whatever those things are called.
The algorithm does not love you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not triggering anything. Nobody's paying attention. No one's seeing it. But when we post regularly, when we post 2 or 3 times a day, is my suggestion. Or if we can't hit that frequency 3 times a week and we're regular and it's engaging and there are pictures of people and we're having fun and people are talking about it and we're asking questions and people are answering, that means we're engaged. We're building clicks and links and likes and stats. The other thing I have seen co-ops be really successful at, I have seen co-ops who do this be successful, is building a kind of a social media champion group. So 3 to 5 people who are on social media, who are looking at it every day anyways, we all are, and we just ask them to like and share our posts and comment. Oh, cool. That's awesome. Yay. Cheer. Hey, they don't have to do anything, they don't have to state their opinion or just simply like, share, or comment. And that changes things. It changes the algorithm. It changes the engagement. Other people see, oh, I'm not the first one to respond. Okay, I can, or it engages them to think, oh yeah, I know her. I'm going to respond to her. And so co-ops who utilize that team really do see success in it. It does work.
It absolutely works. I'm so glad you brought it up because I think a lot of people like feel embarrassed or uncomfortable. Like, oh, well, I'm like, dude, I have watched startups who are just obviously the same 3 to 4 board members are commenting at every post and saying something rah rah, and I'm sure they feel like they are like in romper room. But they and you can say like, oh, like it's the same, but it doesn't matter. Their
Right.
algorithm is better. More people interact, more people see. If people are commenting, you get pushed through the algorithm. And I don't know about you, but most of us watch social media more for the comments than the posts. And so if we know there's 3 comments, well, who commented on that?
Oh, amen. Yes, I
So
do.
it really gets, and I just wanted to talk about this momentum thing though, because I have seen those who communicate consistently. But if you're struggling with ownership growth and getting people to engage with anything about your communication, your events, I don't know about you, I wanted to know if you felt the same. I feel it's a pretty key indicator that you're going to have problems when you get to the actual asking for money.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Oh, and you know what? The other thing it was not on my list, but I intended it to be on my list, was your ability to recruit volunteers is an indicator of success. If you can't recruit volunteers right now for whatever it is you're doing, you can't do it. You can't be successful in your capital campaign. It's not going to happen. That's a key one. And I don't know how that didn't make it on the list, or maybe it was on the list and I skipped it. I don't know, but that is absolutely a key indicator. If you cannot recruit volunteers right now, you will not be successful. If you have an event right now and 2 board members show up and those are the only people that show up, you're not going to have a successful capital campaign. If you have to have events, I'm not saying you have to have events. If your events are not attended, then that means you're not going to have success in your capital campaign. They're not going to engage in that either. If you can't get them to show up for a free wine tasting, they're not going to give you $5,000. That's just a fact. So I'm glad you brought that up, JQ.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to hear you talk about it. And I think that, can you speak to because maybe some people are listening to this and going, oh God, we've always struggled with social media, or we've always struggled with this. And like, so people are hearing maybe we wouldn't be successful right away. And maybe hopefully are taking that to heart and go, maybe we need to pause. let's give some people some hope. Like, so they hear some things on here like, oh, that's not us.
Mhm.
How would you have them approach that?
Well, I'd say that you are in a perfect position right now, because if you've answered, if you've gone through this presentation and you're worried that your co-op's not ready, that's okay, because you have time. Your capital campaign doesn't start tomorrow. We can start to build these pieces, this foundation to make you successful. So we can start recruiting volunteers to work on your social media. We can start putting a structure to your newsletter and creating a calendar so that you can execute that consistently and timely. These are all solvable problems. Absolutely. These are solvable problems. And I absolutely do not want this to be like, oh Lord, we can't do this. You can do it. Co-ops are doing it all over the place. And you can do it when you invest in your co-op. And by that, I mean, you invest time and energy, and you attend sessions like this, and you take this feedback back to your co-op and you put it into practice. I'd be happy to talk with you all more about it if you have specific questions about what's happening at your co-op. But certainly I want you to go out of this knowing what needs to happen to be successful, not to think, oh Lord, we're not ready. Just here's the things we need to do to get ready.
We have a couple more questions, but they're a little more project management-y. So I'm going to jump in on one, and then if you have something to add to it, they're like, well, how do you commit to a site and not have any money yet? So the way this works in startup food co-ops, predominantly, like Katie's been pointing out, there are exceptions to everything, is that you have the ownership growth, you have the momentum to feel comfortable making that commitment, and then you get the commitment with contingencies. So there is a lease or a purchase agreement with contingency. That contingency is based on you raising the money by X date. And we're always pushing for the longest contingency possible, but nothing less than 6 months will do. I've never seen anyone pull it off in less than that. So you are literally committing to a site to build the momentum to go raise the money. We've had 1 or 2 startups attempt to do this without the site. I have never seen success. Katie, have you?
No, and in fact, when a co-op loses their site, which sometimes happens after they've started fundraising stops.
Except for Ed Assabet. That was the one.
Yeah, that was it. Yes, right.
The only one I've ever
kept
seen.
going. They've kept going. You're right. Yes.
They lost the site, and it turned out their owners were kind of happy about it. They didn't love the site. So that worked out, but that's an exception.
Yes, absolutely.
So, okay, I just want to tell you, for those who didn't know that, I know we've got some folks on here who are some earlier stages. Yeah, that's the fun part. You have to be really ready, the way Katie's talking about, because you really can't commit to a site until you're ready to really launch this thing. You're only going to have so much time. So
yeah, and the sooner, you want to launch the campaign as close to your site announcement as you can. You need some time to prepare, but you don't want to lose that momentum. You want to be ready when the time comes.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and ask if there's any last questions. I'll throw it in the chat. Please throw any last questions in the chat for Katie. I can keep asking her questions, believe me. We can get but if you guys have questions, I'd love to hear them and have them see them showing up in the chat. I think that one of the things I was going to ask you about is, you listed all these terrific areas that are important for success. I've seen a lot of startups hit most of them and be weak in a spot or two and still get there. What's kind of like, do they need to be 100% knocking all of these out of the park? What kind of balance have you seen?
Well, that's a good question. I'd say you have to have strong leadership and strong communication. Those have to be 90 or 100%. You have to have really strong there. Other areas, you can have a little wiggle room. Your systems probably, should be in that top tier as well. I'd say 90, 95%. Some people are going to be forgiving, and they're going to, allow you to make a misstep. These are our friends, these are our co-op owners, but not a lot of people are. So that would be the next level, I think, of importance in terms of ability to execute. And then the other things, we can make do in a lot of cases, and especially if we have the right people. If you have the right team that can help each other and compensate, that can help as well. But I would say you can't be successful without the leadership and the communication, and then third be the system.
I'm not seeing additional questions, so I got one more for you, because you kind of hinted toward this. the team who actually, like the capital campaign team and leadership you've got to pull together. What are, I've seen teams, I mean, you had a huge team, I know. And I've also seen startups that pull it off with smaller teams. What is like, what are some of the configurations you've seen work? What is the, how big does this leadership team need to be?
Yeah, a good number, I think, is in that 3 to 5 range. You know, because this the planning and execution work is involved. You know, you've got the legal research, the systems, the communication. That's all time consuming. So if you can delineate that among 3 to 5 people, where I take responsibility for communication and someone else takes responsibility for the legal stuff and someone else the system, then we can get the foundation in place pretty simply. But it typically includes board members. You know, typically this is board work that we see in the planning stage. Sometimes we have volunteers that are not board members that participate, but absolutely it's traditionally board work, and it's work that is attractive to planners, people who like to work behind the scenes, people who like to do research, people who have strong communication skills. And so that's typically who we see do that work. And there's traditionally a ringleader, so to speak, somebody who is setting the meeting agendas and holding people accountable and ensuring that tasks are completed when they are when they should be, when they're due. And so the configuration itself can be very different from co-op to co-op, as you mentioned, but having that person that's kind of the project manager role, whether that's a formal role, you know, that's what they're charged with doing, or if that's their, you know, innate role as the leader, that role indicates success. When you have somebody who's moving it along, is holding you accountable, and making sure that things are getting done is important.
Great. I'm gonna have one last one. We got Tim for just like 2 more minutes. Did you say the typical capital campaign timeframe is 3 months, or did I just make that up?
Preparation time frame, 3 to 6 months of prep time, and you can start preparing for your campaign anytime. In fact, I advocate for now. Well, I don't care where you are at your co-op, start planning it now. At least start communicating about it now. I don't care wherever you are in your timeline. If you're not communicating at least to some extent about your capital campaign, you should be. But the preparation time takes 3 to 6 months, and then the execution of the campaign, when a co-op has multiple phases, which we're seeing that trend here, that not many co-ops are able to successfully raise all the money they need in one phase. That first phase takes 8 to 12 weeks of live asking. So that's the calling, the emailing, the NPR style campaign, 8 to 12 weeks. And then subsequent campaigns we see being shorter. The second one being, 6 to 8 weeks, and then the last campaign, 4-6 weeks long, if a third one is needed.
I'm going to say this is the minute to drop those emails in the chat if you want me to share your email with Katie so she can follow up with you and send you more information. So please go ahead and do that now if you wanted to get information. And I'm just going to take this minute to thanks Katie for bringing all of this expertise and data and information to this, and to kind of a new aspect that we've never talked about before in startup capital campaigns. Thanks so much, Katie.
Yes, it's my pleasure. It's great to see you all.
And I'm going to real quick just share with you guys what's coming up. Hopefully a few of you are joining us. We're getting close to the end of the series, but we've got a few more things happening. So again, thank you to Katie so much for being a part of FCI Live again and sharing her expertise in this area. Keep those emails dropping in the chat if you want her to have them afterwards to send you any additional links or information. We have coming up today, we have 3 today and 3 tomorrow. So this is number 1 of 3. We're coming up in just a couple hours. We have the GM hiring process. That is a panel with the Dorchester Food Co-op, Food Shed, Wild Onion Market. You're not going to hear like, here's what you do. You're going to hear, here's what actually happened, how long it took us, who we used, what we liked, what we didn't. I think you're going to find it really enlightening. Then tonight we have the Co-op Education Toolkit with Rachel Dominguez-Benner. So excited to have her. She was the outreach communication education person for Gem City Market, if you know the story of their fabulous co-op. And she has put together a bunch of free resources, social media posts, slides, information, articles, a little infographic on how to talk about why co-ops matter and the cooperative values and the cooperative movement when you're trying to get your community to understand what is a co-op and why do they want one. She's going to be releasing that tonight. It'll be the first time everyone's seen it. She built this in partnership with FCI. We're really excited to have her coming and presenting that to you and how you can utilize it. And then tomorrow, cooperative solutions for food justice and racial equity. I could not fit it all on there, with Anthony Goodwin and Gabby Davis from National Cooperative Grocers, talking about how NCG is looking at the questions of food justice and racial equity. We hope you can join us. Real quick, we could not be here today if it were not for the generous support of the USDA, National Cooperative Bank, National Cooperative Grocers, and CoBank. Thanks so much to them.